The scent of jasmine and amber was meant to signal paradise, but to the Ottoman princess, it was the scent of the executioner's chamber. A paradox made of silk and gold, of carnelian and fear. In the sprawling, labyrinthine heart of the Topkapi Palace, within the hallowed and hidden confines of the imperial harem, a world of unimaginable opulence pressed in on her. Here, a river of gold flowed from the sultan's treasury, gilding every surface, adorning every body. The air itself was heavy with the fragrance of 1,000 flowers, the murmur of 100 fountains, and the whispers of 1,000 secrets. For a princess of the House of Osman, a sultana, this was the only world she had ever known. She was a living jewel, a testament to the might and magnificence of an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia. Tonight, that magnificence was focused entirely on her. Her wedding procession, the Grand Ally, had been a breathtaking spectacle of imperial power. A column of courtiers, janissaries in their finest regalia, and servants bearing gifts had wound its way through the streets of Istanbul, a public declaration of the dynasty's reach. Her trousseau, the Suez, was a treasure beyond the dreams of lesser monarchs, containing chests overflowing with silks from Bursa, velvets from Italy, pearls from the Gulf, and diamonds that glittered with cold, hard light. But as the echoes of the public celebration faded, replaced by the profound silence of the harem's inner sanctums, the weight of that treasure became a crushing burden. We see her now, not as a symbol, but as a young woman on the precipice of the unknown. Let us call her Zeynep, for her name is every princess's name. Zeynep sits in a chamber draped in fabrics the color of blood and emeralds. Her hands, stained with henna and intricate, lace-like patterns, tremble in her lap. The jewels woven into her hair are so heavy they force her head into a posture of demure submission, a physical manifestation of her duty. She has spent her life surrounded by the women of the harem, her mother, the powerful Valide Sultan, her sisters, her countless attendants and enslaved servants. It was a world of fierce loyalties and fiercer rivalries, but it was a known world. It was home. Tonight, she would be torn from it forever. Her marriage was not a union of hearts. It was a cold, calculated move on the grand chessboard of Ottoman politics. Her father, the Sultan, Padishah of the world, had decreed it. Her body was an instrument of state, a seal upon a political alliance, a reward for a loyal servant, or a gilded chain for a dangerously ambitious one. She was a concession, a prize, a tool. She was anything but a bride. The final walk is an agonizing ritual of separation. She is escorted by the silent, imposing figures of the harem's chief eunuchs, their faces impassive masks. Each step down the familiar marbled corridors takes her further from her past and deeper into a future she cannot control. She passes rooms where she once played as a child, gardens where she learned poetry and calligraphy, and the faces of women who raised her, now veiled in a mixture of pity and ceremonial gravity. The destination is the household of her new husband, a man she may have seen only once, a fleeting glimpse during a court ceremony. His palace is an alien territory, his servants are strangers, and his bed is the site of her impending ordeal. The public pageantry was a lie. The true ceremony was this, a silent, terrifying transfer of ownership. The silence that awaits her is the first wave of fear. The laughter of the harem is gone. The comforting presence of her mother is gone. She is utterly, terrifyingly alone. Behind the ornate door of her bridal chamber, a future of overlapping dangers is coalescing. The first is the man himself, a stranger who holds her fate in his hands. The second is the brutal duty demanded of her, a task that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with dynastic survival. And looming over it all is a terrible shadow, a law of the land so cruel it could turn the fruit of her womb into a target for the executioner's silk cord. The door is about to close, and with it, her childhood, her freedom, and her peace. The fear is not irrational. It is the most rational feeling in the world. It is the cold, hard certainty of what comes next. It is the knowledge that the gilded cage is about to shrink to the size of a single room, a single night, from which she may never emotionally escape. She is a daughter of Osman, a princess of the realm, and she is terrified. Her fear began with the man waiting on the other side. Who was he? Not a Prince Charming, but a cog in a ruthless imperial machine. The man waiting behind that door was not a prince from a neighboring kingdom, for the House of Osman considered itself far too supreme to marry its daughters to other royals. Such a union would imply equality, a concept the Sultan would never entertain. Instead, the princess's intended was a man known by the title Damat-i-Sariyari, the imperial bridegroom. He was invariably a high-ranking state official, a pasha, a general, or, most commonly, the Grand Vizier himself, the second most powerful man in the empire. He was a servant of the throne, and this marriage was his ultimate reward, or his most elegant trap. This shatters the fairy tale illusion. The groom was not a handsome youth, her romantic equal. Far more often, he was a man of her father's generation, or even her grandfather's. He was a hardened politician, a veteran of brutal military campaigns and treacherous court intrigues. His face was likely lined with the stresses of power, his hands calloused from holding a sword or signing death warrants. He was a man who had clawed his way to the pinnacle of a hyper-competitive and violent political system. Love was a language he likely did not speak. Power was his native tongue. Consider the classic 16th-century example of Murima Sultan, the beloved and only daughter of the legendary Suleiman the Magnificent. At the tender age of 17, she was married to Rustam Pasha. Rustam was not a young suitor. He was 50 years old, a calculating and widely disliked Grand Vizier, a man 33 years her senior. This was not a personal choice. It was a strategic masterstroke by her mother, Hurrem Sultan, to solidify her family's control over the state apparatus. Murima was handed over to a powerful, ambitious, and aging man to secure her mother's political faction. She was a living bridge between the harem and the divan, the imperial council. The groom was therefore a stranger, and often, a potential enemy. He was a man whose career was built on navigating the lethal currents of the court. He had rivals, enemies who would celebrate his downfall. The marriage, intended to elevate him, also painted a target on his back. By marrying him, the princess was shackling her own fate to his precarious political fortunes. If he fell, she would fall with him. The power imbalance in the bridal chamber was a terrifying inversion of the outside world. In the court, her title of Sultana commanded deference. She was of the sacred blood of Osman. He was, in the end, a promoted slave or servant of her father. But within the confines of their private quarters, the dynamic was brutally reversed. He was the husband, and she the wife. He held all the immediate physical authority. Her royal status was a gilded shield that offered no protection in this intimate, isolated space. In fact, it could be a source of intense resentment. For a man like Rustam Pasha, a man of immense pride and ambition, being married to the Sultan's daughter was both an honor and a subtle humiliation. It was a constant reminder that his power was borrowed, that his position was dependent on the Sultan's favor. The wedding night, the act of consummation, became more than a marital duty. It was a visceral opportunity to assert his dominance over a woman who, by the sheer accident of her birth, was his celestial superior. It was a moment to prove that here, in this room, he was the master. This dynamic was ripe for cruelty, for a man to take out his political frustrations and insecurities on the young woman delivered to him. The fear of the princess, then, was not just of a stranger, but of a powerful, seasoned man who might see her not as a wife, but as a symbol of the imperial authority he both served and resented. A man who understood that their union was not about intimacy, but about the cold, hard currency of power. But the fear of the man himself was only the beginning. The true terror lay in what was demanded of her body, not for love or pleasure, but for the brutal calculus of the empire. Once the chamber door was sealed, the princess's body ceased to be her own. It became an asset of the state, her womb a vessel for imperial strategy. The primary purpose of this union, and the terrifying ordeal of the wedding night, was centered on a high-stakes reproductive gamble. But unlike in other royal houses where producing a male heir was the ultimate prize, for an Ottoman princess, it could be the ultimate curse. Here lies the chilling paradox at the heart of her fear. Her fertility, the very source of a woman's value in the patriarchal world, could be her greatest liability. The reason was pure, cold-blooded politics. Any male child born to a princess, a sultanzade, was a direct descendant of the ruling house of Osman through the maternal line. He carried the sacred blood. While the throne officially passed from the Sultan to one of his own sons, history was filled with bloody civil wars and succession struggles. A sultan's aide, especially one with a powerful and ambitious father like a grand vizier, was a latent threat. He could become a figurehead for a rebellion, a rallying point for disgruntled factions within the army or the court. In the ruthless world of Ottoman power, a potential rival was as good as an active one. His very existence was a destabilizing factor. Therefore, an unspoken, unwritten, but deadly serious command often hung over the marriage bed. There were to be no sons. The princess was trapped in an impossible dilemma. To be barren was to fail in her womanly duty, to invite scorn and perhaps even divorce. But to bear a son was to commit a form of treason, to create a potential threat to her own brother or nephew on the throne. It was a terrifying tightrope walk where a misstep in either direction could lead to ruin. The pressure was immense and insidious. Historical sources are murky on the precise methods used to enforce this grim policy, but the implications are horrifying. Husbands, the powerful daemads, were likely warned in no uncertain terms by the Sultan. Their continued career, and indeed their life, depended on their discretion and their ability to control the outcome of their marital relations. This could have involved crude and unreliable methods of contraception, or more simply, the practice of withdrawal, placing the entire burden of dynastic security on a moment of physical control. For the princess, it turned the act of intimacy into a moment of profound anxiety. Every union carried with it the fear of a forbidden conception. A missed menstrual cycle would not be a cause for joy, but for sheer terror. While sons were a danger, daughters were a different matter entirely. Daughters were politically valuable. A daughter born to a princess and a vizier could, in turn, be married off to another rising pasha, weaving an even tighter web of loyalty and influence controlled by the central dynasty. Daughters extended the family's power without threatening it. So, the ideal outcome of the princess's reproductive life was to produce a string of politically useful daughters, while meticulously avoiding the creation of a single, dangerous son. The wedding night was the terrifying inauguration of this lifelong duty. It was the moment she became a political womb, a vessel whose contents would be scrutinized, managed, and feared by the most powerful men in the world. The joy of motherhood was poisoned from the start by the dread of giving birth to the wrong gender. It was a unique and cruel form of psychological torment, a private horror dictated by public policy. The fear of producing a son was very real, because every princess knew what the Sultan, her own father or brother, was capable of doing to secure his throne. She knew about the law written in blood. To understand the deepest root of the princess's fear, we must look beyond the bridal chamber and into the dark heart of Ottoman dynastic law. We must speak of the Fatih Canonomacy, the law code of the conqueror. In the 15th century, Sultan Mehmed II, the man who conquered Constantinople, faced a brutal reality. The greatest threat to the stability of the empire was not an external enemy, but civil war between Ottoman princes vying for the throne upon a sultan's death. His solution was as pragmatic as it was horrifying. He codified the practice of royal fratricide, writing it into law. The infamous article states, with chilling clarity, "For the welfare of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the sultanate may lawfully put his brothers to death." It was a state-sanctioned license for murder, framing the killing of one's own siblings not as a sin, but as a sorrowful public duty, a sacrifice made for the greater good, to prevent the chaos and bloodshed of a succession war that could tear the empire apart. For generations, this law was brutally enforced. Upon ascending the throne, the new sultan's first order was often to have his brothers, including infants in their cradles, strangled with a silk cord, their royal blood being forbidden to be spilled. As the centuries passed, this practice evolved into something perhaps psychologically crueler. From the early 17th century onward, instead of immediate execution, the princes were often confined to a set of opulent rooms within the Topkapi Palace known as the Kafes, or the cage. Here they lived in a gilded prison, under constant guard, with no contact with the outside world, often for decades. They were surrounded by luxury, but denied freedom, responsibility, and human connection. Many were driven to madness, alcoholism, or despair, emerging as broken, incompetent rulers if they were ever called to the throne. This was the family legacy into which every Ottoman princess was born. This was the shadow that loomed over her wedding night. She had grown up in a palace where this systemic violence was the bedrock of stability. She knew that her father or brother, the Sultan, had the legal and religious sanction to kill his own kin for the sake of power. This knowledge informed her deepest terror. If the Sultan could eliminate his own brothers, what mercy would he show to her son, a Sultan's aide? Her son, a nephew or cousin to the ruling monarch, with a powerful father and a direct link to the throne, would be a perpetual source of paranoia. The princess understood that the wedding night was the potential first step toward creating a life that she would have to spend every single day protecting. It was the beginning of a lifetime of fear. Every political tremor in the capital, every rumor of a military mutiny, every whisper of dissatisfaction with the Sultan could be a death sentence for her child. Her husband's ambition, once a source of pride, would become a terrifying liability, as any move he made could be interpreted as a conspiracy to place their son on the throne. The law of fratricide wasn't just an abstract political doctrine. It was a source of profound, generational trauma that saturated the imperial family. The princess would have seen its effects firsthand. An uncle who was never spoken of, a cousin locked away in the caves, his laughter replaced by vacant stares. She knew the brutal calculus of her family, and so, as she lay in her wedding bed, the act of consummation was overshadowed by the specter of a silk cord. The potential for creation was inextricably linked to the potential for annihilation. The fear for a future son was a nightmare in the distance. But on the wedding night itself, a more immediate, physical ordeal awaited. An ancient ritual that would be performed not in privacy, but under scrutiny. Beyond the political and dynastic terrors, the wedding night held a more immediate, physical, and profoundly humiliating ordeal for the princess. This was the ancient, near-universal ritual of proving the bride's virginity, a practice elevated to an affair of state within the Ottoman court. The so-called proof was crude and visceral, the blood-stained bedsheet. This piece of linen was not a private matter between husband and wife. It was a public document, a piece of evidence to be presented and verified, confirming that the princess had come to the marriage bed intact and that the union had been officially sealed. The honor of the dynasty rested on this fragile, biological evidence. To ensure the process was properly observed, the couple was granted no real privacy. Key female figures, typically trusted senior servants or midwives, the Khaden, who were fiercely loyal to the princess's mother, the Valide Sultan, were stationed just outside the chamber door. Their sole purpose was to receive the sheet immediately after the consummation, inspect it for the required proof, and then discreetly deliver it to the Queen Mother for final verification. The weight of this expectation created a climate of unbearable performance anxiety. This pressure fell not only on the terrified young princess, but also on her powerful, older husband. Any failure to complete the act and produce the bloody evidence could trigger a political crisis. For the groom, it could be seen as a sign of impotence or, even more dangerously, a deliberate political insult, a refusal to seal the union with the Sultan's daughter. For the princess, the consequences were even more dire. A lack of blood would immediately cast suspicion on her virtue, a stain on her honor that could never be erased. It could lead to the annulment of the marriage and her utter disgrace. In this high-stakes environment, the entire event was stripped of any potential for tenderness or intimacy. It was a clinical, goal-oriented procedure. This was made infinitely worse by the complete and total medical ignorance of the era. The concept that many virgins do not bleed upon first intercourse was entirely unknown. The immense psychological pressure and fear could make the physical act itself painful or even impossible for the princess. There was no understanding of the delicate interplay between mind and body. Any difficulty was interpreted not as a natural consequence of anxiety or physiology, but as a moral or physical failing on her part. The act of consummation itself, under these conditions, could become a brutal and traumatizing ordeal. For a groom facing political ruin if he failed, patience and gentleness were luxuries he might not afford. The act could become a desperate, forceful assault aimed solely at producing the required biological proof, regardless of the pain or terror inflicted upon his bride. And the ordeal did not end with the act itself. The aftermath was a crucible of public scrutiny. Once the sheet was presented to the Valide Sultan, the news of success or failure would spread through the intricate gossip networks of the harem and the court with stunning speed. By morning, the princess's reputation would be sealed. Her performance on her wedding night would define how she was perceived for years to come, influencing her standing within her new household and her relationship with the imperial family she had left behind. It was a night of profound violation, not just of her body, but of her dignity and her spirit. It was a ritual designed to transform her from a royal daughter into a political wife, and the process was invasive, terrifying, and utterly dehumanizing. If she survived this night of political and physical scrutiny, her life would not become her own. Her marriage was often the beginning of a new kind of prison, a gilded exile designed to neutralize the very man she was forced to marry. Surviving the wedding night was not the end of the ordeal. It was merely the beginning of a new, lonelier chapter. The marriage that was supposed to elevate her husband often served the opposite purpose, to remove him from power. The core political logic was simple and ruthless. A man who married a sultana gained a direct, intimate connection to the imperial family. He was no longer just a servant of the sultan. He was family. If this man was already a powerful grand vizier or a popular general residing in the capital of Istanbul, this new prestige made him dangerously influential. He could become a rival power center, a potential kingmaker, or worse, a usurper in the making. The Ottoman system, ever paranoid about internal threats, had a brilliant and cruel solution to this problem: honorable banishment. Very often, upon his marriage to the princess, the damned would be immediately promoted to the governorship of a distant and challenging province. He might be sent to oversee Damascus, to command the armies in Baghdad, or to govern the turbulent frontier province of Buda. On the surface, it was a great honor. In reality, it was a gilded exile, a way for the sultan to move a powerful piece off the central chessboard and place him on the periphery of the empire, far from the conspiracies and kingmakers of the Topkapi court. This political maneuver dictated the princess's fate. She was compelled to leave the only home she had ever known. The splendors and intrigues of the Topkapi palace, the familiar faces of her family and servants, the entire world that had shaped her, were all to be left behind. She would embark on a long and arduous journey with her new husband to a provincial capital she had only read about in books. In this strange new land, she was completely isolated. She was cut off from her support network, from the formidable power of her mother, the Valide Sultan, and from the comforting familiarity of her culture. Her entire existence was now dependent on the very man who might well see her as the cause of his political sidelining. This created a marriage poisoned by resentment from its inception. The husband, a man of immense ambition, may have chafed at being sent away from the heart of the empire. He could easily blame his royal wife for this interruption to his career trajectory. For the princess, this meant living with a man who was not just a stranger, but a potentially bitter and resentful one. She was a constant reminder of the golden chains that now bound him. Her new life on the political frontier was one of perpetual instability. She was no longer cocooned by the security of the imperial palace. Her life and safety were now directly tied to her husband's precarious fortunes. Provincial politics were a viper's nest of local rivalries and military threats. If her husband governed well, he might be celebrated, but if he failed, or if his enemies in Istanbul conspired against him, he could be recalled in disgrace, demoted, or, as was often the case, summarily executed. His fall would leave her a widow, stranded hundreds of miles from home, her own future uncertain. The marriage, therefore, did not bring security. It brought a life of constant anxiety, lived on the edge of the empire's turbulent frontiers. The fairy tale of marrying a powerful man dissolved into the harsh reality of being a political consort in a dangerous and lonely outpost. It was another layer of fear, a slow-burning dread that replaced the acute terror of the wedding night. Isolated in a distant province with a resentful husband, the princess was still not free from the dangers of the court she left behind. The eyes and ears of the harem were everywhere, and the psychological warfare never ceased. Even in a distant provincial palace in Syria or the Balkans, the princess was never truly free. The walls of the Topkapi harem had a long reach, and its political machinations extended across the empire through an invisible network of loyalty and espionage. The psychological warfare that defined her life in the capital simply followed her into exile. The harem was not just the sultan's private quarters. It was the nerve center of imperial intelligence, a political institution dominated by powerful women. The princess's mother, the Valide Sultan, or her influential sisters, would ensure they had eyes and ears inside their exiled daughter's new household. Loyal servants, eunuchs, and ladies-in-waiting would be planted in her retinue, their primary function being to send detailed reports back to Istanbul. Every aspect of her new life was under surveillance. The state of her relationship with her husband, the political leanings of his advisors, her personal health, and, most critically, any signs of pregnancy. She was simultaneously a wife and a spy, caught in a web of conflicting loyalties. The Valide Sultan, who often orchestrated these political marriages in the first place, expected her daughter to act as an agent for her family's faction back at court. The princess was tasked with gathering intelligence on her husband's activities, his ambitions, and the political climate of his province. This placed her in an impossibly dangerous position. If she was loyal to her mother and reported truthfully, she risked betraying her husband, the man upon whom her daily life and safety depended. If she was loyal to her husband and concealed information, she risked incurring the wrath of the most powerful woman in the empire, her own mother. There was no safe path. Her new home was also a battleground. Her husband, the damned Pasha, almost certainly had other wives, and a household filled with his own concubines, children, and established servants. To them, the royal princess was an intruder, a high-ranking rival who threatened the existing hierarchy. The internal politics of this smaller, provincial seraglio could be just as vicious and suffocating as those of the Topkapi Palace. Rival wives might plot against her, attempting to poison her relationship with her husband, spreading malicious gossip, or even resorting to more sinister means of sabotage. Amidst this constant scrutiny and internal strife, the princess was forced to maintain the facade of perfection. She was the living embodiment of the Ottoman dynasty's prestige. She had to be flawlessly dignified, impeccably pious, and outwardly submissive to her husband, all while navigating a treacherous landscape of espionage and domestic rivalry. A single misstep, a rumored indiscretion, or a perceived failure to uphold the imperial standard could be reported back to the Sultan, leading to her disgrace and her husband's downfall. This relentless pressure, this life lived under a microscope thousands of miles from home, took an immense psychological toll. The acute fear of the wedding night metastasized into a chronic, gnawing anxiety. It was a life of paranoia, where every servant could be a spy, every kind word could mask a hidden agenda, and every private moment was potentially public knowledge. The gilded cage had not been opened. Its bars had simply become invisible, stretching across the vastness of the empire to keep her firmly within its grasp. Trapped between a powerful husband and a watchful family, many princesses wondered if there was any escape. But in the Ottoman world, even the end of a marriage was not a liberation, but another form of punishment. The modern notion of a royal marriage as a sacred, lifelong bond, till death do us part, simply did not apply in the pragmatic world of Ottoman politics. This is another myth that must be shattered. For the Ottoman princess, the end of her marriage was not a personal decision, nor was it necessarily a permanent state. Divorce was a readily available and frequently used political tool, wielded not by the princess, but by her father or brother, the Sultan. If her husband, the damned Pasha, fell out of political favor, if he became too ambitious, if his enemies at court successfully conspired against him, or if he was simply no longer strategically useful, the Sultan could end the union with the stroke of a pen. The husband would be ordered to divorce the princess. For the man, this was the ultimate public disgrace. He was stripped of his prestigious connection to the imperial family, a clear signal to the entire political class that his career was over. Often, this forced divorce was a prelude to his exile, confiscation of his wealth, or execution. The marriage that had been the symbol of his ascent became the instrument of his destruction. But for the princess, this was no liberation. It was a different kind of humiliation. She was sent back to the palace, no longer a maiden bride but a divorced woman, a political asset that had been used and returned. Her value on the dynastic marriage market was now diminished. She was a living symbol of a failed political alliance, a reminder of her ex-husband's disgrace. She would return to a harem that had moved on, to a family whose political priorities had shifted. She was, in essence, placed back on the shelf, waiting to be redeployed when a new political necessity arose. This led to one of the most tragic fates for some Ottoman princesses, that of the serial bride. It was not uncommon for a princess to be married multiple times throughout her life. If her first husband was executed, she would be married to his replacement. If she was divorced, she would be remarried to a new, rising political star whom the Sultan wished to bind to the throne. Women like Fatma Sultan, a daughter of Sultan Ahmed III, were married off multiple times, their lives a succession of politically arranged unions. Imagine the horror of this existence. The terror of the wedding night was not a single ordeal to be survived and put in the past. It was a recurring nightmare. Each new marriage brought a new stranger to her bed, a new set of political dangers, a new exile, and a new household of rivals. Her life became a relentless cycle of being used as a political pawn, her own desires, feelings, and hopes for stability completely irrelevant. She had absolutely no agency in these decisions. Her consent was not requested. Her obedience was commanded. She could be married, widowed, divorced, and remarried, all at the whim of the male head of her family. Her life was not her own. It was a series of chapters, each one written by the brutal, pragmatic needs of the state. The wedding night, therefore, was not just an event. It was a symbol of her entire life, a life of perpetual uncertainty, of being passed from one powerful man to another, a precious object whose only function was to secure the power of others. A pawn in a game she could never win. Her wedding night was not one night, but a symbol of her entire existence. A life of fear, duty, and sacrifice, bound forever in golden chains. The terror of the Ottoman princess on her wedding night was not a single, simple fear. It was a complex tapestry woven from many threads of dread. It was the primal fear of the unknown groom, a powerful older man whose intentions were a mystery. It was the political fear of her own body, of a womb that could bring forth either a politically useful daughter or a lethally dangerous son. It was the genealogical fear passed down through the bloodline, the knowledge of the law of fratricide, and the ever-present specter of the executioner's silk cord that haunted any male child she might bear. It was the visceral, humiliating fear of the physical ordeal of consummation, a clinical procedure performed under scrutiny, where her very honor was at stake. And it was the lingering fear of the future that followed, a life of lonely exile, of constant surveillance, or the grim possibility of being serially married off, her life a repeating cycle of the same terrifying night. These fears combined to create a psychological prison far more confining than the walls of the harem. Yet, to cast these women solely as victims is to deny them their incredible resilience and agency. Trapped within this brutal system, many Ottoman princesses learned not only to survive, but to thrive. They became masters of the very political game in which they were pawns. Unable to rule directly, they wielded immense influence as advisors, power brokers, and patrons. The great Murayma Sultan, daughter of Suleiman, became a powerful political figure in her own right, corresponding with foreign kings and commissioning some of Istanbul's most magnificent mosques, shaping the very skyline of the imperial capital. They managed vast personal fortunes, endowed charitable foundations, and used their unique position to navigate the treacherous currents of the court, often outmaneuvering the most powerful men in the empire. They turned their golden chains into weapons and tools of influence. Their story is the hidden human cost of empire. The immense stability, longevity, and grandeur of the Ottoman state for over 600 years was not built merely on the strength of its armies or the wisdom of its sultans. It was built on the silent, profound sacrifices of its women. The stability of the throne, the prevention of civil war, and the intricate web of political loyalties were all secured by the strategic deployment of these royal daughters. Their personal happiness and safety were secondary to the welfare of the state. Their bodies, their children, and their lives were the currency of power. In the end, the jewels, the silks, the palaces, and the pageantry were all the beautiful, elaborate architecture of a cage. The true story of the Ottoman princess is not a fairy tale of romance and privilege. It is a gripping, often tragic human drama of survival against impossible odds. The fear she felt on her wedding night was not an aberration. It was the logical, inevitable price she paid for the sacred and cursed imperial blood that flowed through her veins.